What some people experience when they go through these depths of long winters is something called seasonal affective disorder. In other words, it's the winter blues, where you just kind of get a little bit down and depressed during the winter. And we know this is a phenomenon. It's linked to this mismatch of your circadian rhythm and all of the light signals or the excessive dark signals in the depths of winter. And one of the ways that you can help is in the winter, when you wake up in the morning, you can use these things called light boxes. Light is the principal way, light and darkness are the principal ways that we reset and we keep good circadian 24-hour time. But there are other things that the brain and the body can latch onto to reset the clock. One of those things is food. So try to eat at regular times, at the standard times that you would eat otherwise, because food can be a powerful cue to keep you regular in terms of your signaled schedule. And then also exercise. So exercising in the first half of the day, particularly in the middle of the winter, that can also help in terms of a cue that helps keep time and time in a more strict way for your brain and your body when it is confused about time because the main source of its timekeeping is lost, which is reliable daylight during the day and reliable darkness at night.
Hlustendur góðir, Matthew Walker gestur þáttarins. Dr. Matthew Walker, prófessor við Berkeley háskóla og sérfræðingur í svefni, sálfræði og taugalífeðlisfræði. Hann hefur farið mikinn síðustu árin og í kjölfar útgáfu bókar sinnar Why We Sleep. Það er alltaf hægt að taka upp podcast þar sem heilsa rædd og bókin hans ekki. Rannsóknir Matthews og framsetning niðurstaðana hafa gert heilmikið fyrir mig persónulega og minn svefn og ég veit að sömu sögu má segja marga aðra Íslendinga. Mér langaði þess vegna að fókusa svolítið á Ísland og þessar suboptimal aðstæður sem við höfum komið okkur í hér í Norður Atlantshafi. Skammdegið hefur ekki farið fram hjá neinum síðustu daga og koffínneyslan líklegast aukist í kjölfarið. Matthew kemur með frábær sér íslensk ráð sem hægt að nýta sér rakleiðis og einhverju leyti staðreyndir sem hægt að líta á sem hryllilegar eða stórkostlegar, fyrir eftir því hvað þú vilt gera við upplýsingarnar. Umræðefnin eru mörg, svo takið vel eftir. Þetta er verulega þéttur klukkutími mikilvægi svefns á mismunandi æviskeiðum, sérstaklega fyrir unglinga, hvort samfélagið sé að bregðast svefnþörfum einstaklingsins, sólarljós og líkamsklukkan, sérstaklega mikilvægt fyrir okkur Íslendingana. Koffíndrykkja, af hverju Matthew ekki á móti kaffidrykkju en hvað þarf að varast í tengslu við kaffi frá sjónarhorni sérfræðings, orkudrykkir og neysla þeirra meðal ungmenna á Íslandi, hvernig svefn varnarhlið andlegra kvilla og af hverju í andskotanum það álitin leti að vilja sofa lengur. Þú ert að fara að heyra frábærar upplýsingar svefninn og grunnstóð heilsuðinnar og þessi þáttur rúlar óhindraður og ókeypis í eyrunum á þér í boði eftirfarandi meistara. Þið heyri Matthew tala dagljósavekjaraklukkur og hvernig hægt að nýta það vopn í baráttunni gegn skammdeginu hérlendis. Eirberg selja Lumi dagljósavekjaraklukkurnar og Lumi dagljósin sem bæði líka eftir sólarupprás þegar við vöknum og gefa okkur nægilegt ljós yfir daginn sem bætir líðan og eykur afköst. Þessi tæki eru meira að segja flokkuð sem klass 2A lækningatæki. Ég nota svona, Matthew mælir með þessu. Þið finnið þetta á eirberg.is og í verslun þeirra á Stórhöfða 25. Sofðu rótt frá Ice Herbs kröftug og náttúrulega laust fyrir bættan svefn. Sofðu rótt inniheldur magnolíubörk og íslensk fjallagrös. Saman virka þessar tvær jurtir einstaklega vel til þess að bæta svefn á náttúrulegan hátt. Þessi öfluga blanda hentar sömuleiðis fyrir þá sem vilja bæta andlega líðan vegna þess að magnólía hefur verið notuð aldir við þunglindi, svefnvandamálum, kvíða og streitu. Hún þekktur að virka almennt slakandi og róandi og bæta eðlilegan og samfelldan svefn. Sofðu rótt frá Ice Herbs fyrir dýpri og betri svefn. Svo höfum við örugglega öll heyrt magnesiumvörurnar frá Better You en Magnesium Sleep vörulínan frá Better You samanstendur af Magnesium Sleep húðmjólk fyrir fullorðna annars vegar og börn hins vegar og Magnesium Sleep baðflögunum húðmjólk. Þetta er magnað orð. Flögurnar leysast upp í vatni, frábært í baðkarið eftir langan vinnudag. Magnesium Sleep húðmjólkin inniheldur magnesium til að hjálpa þreyttum vöðvum að ná slökum, lavander og kamelu til að róa og undirbúa líkamann fyrir svefnin. Ég nota þetta mest í den til að flýta endurheimt þegar maður var nánast komið með Rabdó eftir einhverja crossfit-æfinguna en þetta svínvirkar vist fyrir slökunina líka. Svo það Melissa Dream sem í stuttu máli náttúrulegt svefnbætiefni sem styður við aukinn svefngæði, inniheldur mikilvægar jurtir og steinefni eins og einmitt magnesium sem stuðla að slökun. Það hefur ekki sljókandi áhrif enda náttúrulegt og fæst í næsta apóteki og heilsuhillum stórmarkaða. Við í rauninni vitum það öll og ef þið vitið ekki þá munið þið fá að vita eftir cirka bát klukkutíma að svefnin grunnstoð góðrar heilsu. Bætum hreyfingu og næringu inn í þetta og við erum orðin nokkuð skotelt. Grundvöllur góðrar næringar fita og við viljum hágæða fitusýrur fyrir okkar hágæða líkama. Olíurnar frá lifa vörumerkinu eru nákvæmlega það. Kaldpressaðar, lífrænar, óunnar, tandurhreinar fitusýrur frá Ítalíu. Það sem líkaminn þráir til að starfa eðlilega og það ótrúlega að bragðlaukarnir þrá þetta líka. Nú þegar jólin renna í hlað finnið þú fallega og lifa gjafapoka í verslunum og mun andvirði þeirra renna til votlendissjóðs. Gott fyrir líkamann, gott á bragðið og gott fyrir samfélagið. Eiginlega of gott til að vera satt, þetta ólífadæmi. Íseikt skyr kynni til leiks sérstaka eldgosa útgáfu. Eldgosa útgáfa af skyr, hugsa sér. Hversu sér íslensk getur ein vara orðið. Bragðtegundin á eldgosa útgáfunni karamellu pop, bæði geggjuð og eingöngu í boði í takmarkaðan tíma. Þrusu próteinríkt, 15 grömm af próteini í einni dós og þessi útgáfa einnig kolvetnaskert fyrir ykkur sem haldi kolvetnunum í fjarlag fram að hátíðunum. Að lokum það dekúbal. Ég veit að þið eru öll að fást við ykkar vandamál og íttu ekki að playa á sem þetta til að heyra af mínum en leið og það kólnar í veðri þá þotnar húðin á mér upp. Hún bara þotnar upp. Ég hef ekki þorað að kreppa hnefana síðan í september. Þetta ríkt frásögn en það sem leysti þetta var dekúbalkremið. Grínlaust. Ég veit ekki einu svona hvaða útgáfu af dekúbal ég með. Ég held þetta sé bara dekúbal original eða álíka. En ég hef aldrei verið betri í húðinni enda dekúbalkremin án allar parabena, ilm og eiturefna. Nákvæmlega eins og viljum hafa. Dekúbal fæst í næsta apóteki. 1000 þakkir til styrktaraðala þáttarins. Nú komið að svefn sérfræðingnum Matthew Walker. Gjörðu þið svo vel.
Yeah, it's been amazing. After releasing the book, I've been able to travel the world and speak to remarkable people in remarkable places. And what a gift that is! I feel very lucky. I am very, very fortunate.
You're feeling fortunate and feeling lucky going into this podcast. Are you ready to record?
I am excited to speak and answer all of your questions.
Perfect, Matthew Walker. Thank you so much for doing this, and welcome to the show.
Oh, it's a delight and a privilege to be here, Snorri.
So I'm wondering if I can start out with just a personal question for you. The Joe Rogan interview, that was quite a big one for you, wasn't it?
It was, and it was a surprise. I didn't really know it was coming. I got a call from his booking agent 24 hours before who said, Joe is fascinated by this topic of sleep and the book. You've got a slot tomorrow morning. You've got a flight in 4 hours. Come on down to Los Angeles. So I was at the gym at the time when I got the call. I raced back home, packed my bag, went there. It was wonderful. And it was wonderful for at least two reasons. The first is that, he will play the fool. He will pretend that he's not so smart. He is incredibly bright. But two additional things made that interview so wonderful for me. The first is that he's present. And what I mean by that, he didn't get distracted. He was with me for I think it was over 2 hours. Every second I could see he was connected sort of in this discussion. And then the second thing is curiosity. He is just so endlessly curious. And we could have spoken for another 2 hours. He just has so many questions. He's very, very good at interviewing. So, gosh, that was a delight. And I didn't really know, firstly, I didn't know it was being broadcast live on the video feed.
No way.
Not that would have changed anything, but I probably would have decreased some of my idiotic facial expressions. And then I didn't quite realize, and I don't think Joe realized how popular that podcast would end up being. And that was a great experience for me.
Yeah, how is it like for you? I hadn't heard of you before that podcast, and you being a scientist, and well, you sound like a pretty humble person, not looking for media attention, going getting millions of views on YouTube on a 2-hour episode about sleep.
It was very unusual, I have to say, and it had started happening probably about 6 months before that, because I'd given a TED talk, and that TED talk ended up going viral. I think it's sort of got something like 13 million views or something, hard to believe for me. And then that started the whirlwind of public exposure. And then Joe Rogan, and then a number of other things happened. And it's been interesting. I feel very privileged and fortunate to be one of the voices for this thing called sleep, to communicate its importance to the public. And there are many other great scientists who are also a voice for sleep. But because I'm quite a private person and a little bit of an introvert, somewhat shy, it's been quite difficult to be in the public eye, particularly when, as soon as you get some degree of notoriety, not everything is going to be kind in terms of the comments or what people try to offer to you. And that was hard because I'm probably not particularly thick-skinned, and you read every comment, you read every online blog. And so that's been the challenge, as to how to develop a slightly tougher, thicker skin and still maintain this wonderful position that I'm in, to be able to communicate to, and on shows like yours, to speak with people about sleep and why I think it's so important.
Yeah, and it's like funny that you would think that somebody would need to be brave to step out with like information about something that could help like millions and millions. Well, like if not all people in the world.
I thought that too, until, and then, there's always going to be, firstly, some debate with science. Science, you never prove anything with science. You really just indicate what is most likely at that time based on the existing data. And then also the book, it turns out it was full of facts. I think it's well over 1,000 facts or something like that. You're probably going to get a few things wrong. And when people point those out, it's hard because it can be a little challenging. But the important thing as a scientist is, firstly, to never have a closed mind. And if there's contrary data to what you believed, you changed your opinion, and you change it frequently based on data. That's the beauty about not being a politician. You don't have to stick to the same thing and never change your mind, because changing your mind as a scientist is a good thing. And then the second is that if you make any errors, I think it's imperative as the scientific method for you to correct those errors. And so, there's now been a couple of editions of the book, and every time there's a new edition, I always try to correct anything that people have pointed out that was, needs to be changed or modified or updated. So that's been the way I've responded to that.
Yeah, nice. And like, I just wanted to mention that video because like it obviously went viral, and I've Joe has released around 2,000 episodes of his podcast, and I've never met so many people that have seen this like single episode. Like I know so many people around me here in Iceland have watched it and listened to you and bought the book, and it sounds like it went like a little more viral than some of the other 1,000.
It did, yeah. And it was the same way with the book, that I genuinely thought that at least 2 people would buy the book, which would be my mother and my father, and that would be it. And it ended up selling a few more than that. So
it was your mother and Joe Rogan, and that changed everything.
Yeah, which sounds like a Freudian psychoanalytic therapy session. It was your mother and Joe Rogan. But yes, I think the answer is yes.
Awesome. I was just curious about it. So, but let's dive into sleep. And I thought like a good starting point and a pretty broad topic would be a circadian rhythm. And I want to lead us into talking about circadian rhythm and the sunlight in Iceland, because you're doomed to coming here. You're doing a reference here in a conference here in late November 22nd. And I was just curious if you could explain to us, like, what is the circadian rhythm and what influences it?
So every one of us has an unwavering, consistent 24-hour rhythm. And that rhythm is drummed out in terms of its rhythmic 24-hour beat by way of a central clock. And that central clock sits deep within your brain, right in the middle of the brain. And if you want to be bored by the anatomy, it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. But let's just call it the 24-hour clock. Now, it turns out that you actually have little clocks in almost every cell of your body, and they all keep time. But there is a little bit like Lord of the Rings, like there's one ring to rule them all. Well, there's one clock to rule them all. And that clock, that master clock, is the one that sits in your brain. And so every species, or most species that we've studied to date, at least all mammals, they have this 24-hour rhythm. And the reason is that it keeps us in synchrony, in harmony with the 24-hour cycle of our planet around the sun. And so there is light and there is dark. And that 24-hour rhythm for diurnal species, which is what we are as human beings, means that we like to be awake during the day and we like to be asleep at night. So we're active during the light and we're inactive during the dark. And I say light and dark rather than day and night because it's going to have relevance to your question and your geographical location.
Exactly.
So we have this 24-hour rhythm, and one of the things that it instructs is your sleep-wake rhythm. Now, it controls lots of other things, the release of hormones, your desire to be cognitively active, your desire to be physiologically optimal for certain types of food at certain types of day. It controls a vast amount of things. But when you want to be awake and when you want to be asleep is one of those things. So the way that your 24-hour rhythm is signaled to the brain and the body in terms of sleep and wake is through a hormone called melatonin. And when we are given the signal of darkness through our eyes, the brain starts to release this hormone called melatonin. And melatonin signals to the brain and the body it's nighttime and that it's time to sleep. But then when we wake up the next morning and we're exposed to daylight, the opposite happens, which is that daylight acts as a brake pedal on melatonin and it shuts melatonin down. And now, because there's no circulating melatonin because of bright light, your brain says, now I realize it's the day and it's time to be awake. And so you're active, the activity of your cells and the brain, they rise during the daytime and then they fall down at night because of this instructional cue called melatonin saying it's dark and it's light. So one of the difficulties is that if you live in the more of the extreme latitudes, north or south, during the winter months, you are a light deprived society because you're not getting sufficient light. And so your brain and your body are perhaps fooled into thinking it's more night time than it actually is on the clock. Because, at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, it's still the daytime. But because it's dark in the depth of winter, your brain is releasing that melatonin and thinking it's nighttime. Whereas then in the summer, the opposite happens. At 1 a.m. in the morning, your brain is still being told it's the daytime because light is still coming through your eyes and there is no melatonin being released. So this is where you have a misalignment between your circadian rhythm and your environment. The environment is telling you one thing, whereas the actual 24-hour clock and your brain and your body want it to be something different.
And is that something that we have to fight as like somebody who wakes up and it's like dark outside and like afternoon it gets dark outside again? Can you signal like help with the signals or are we just living in suboptimal conditions?
You can work with the system. And I say that not just because hopefully that's what a lot of people want to hear. And also the fact that it is such a beautiful country. Why would you want to necessarily live anywhere else in the world? But the fact that, yes, there are strategic things that we can do to help. What some people experience when they go through these depths of long winters is something called seasonal affective disorder. In other words, it's the winter blues, where you just kind of get a little bit down and depressed during the winter. And we know this is a phenomenon. It's linked to this mismatch of your circadian rhythm and all of the light signals or the excessive dark signals in the depths of winter. And one of the ways that you can help is in the winter, when you wake up in the morning, you can use these things called light boxes. So as you're sitting there having your breakfast or you're starting your day at work, you can have this sort of sizable light box in front of you, and it emits very strong, powerful lux. Now, lux is a measure of light. It's the intensity of the photons that are hitting your eye. And to mimic daylight, it turns out you need a very strong light. So lights above our heads, even if we're in, our homes and we think, gosh, it's bright light, that bright light is still nowhere near as bright and powerful as a cloudy day if you were to go outside, just to give you a sense of that. So the artificial light that you need to really tell your brain and your body, oh, it's actually daytime, even though it's January outside, it's completely black and it's 10 a.m. in the morning, you can fool the brain with this very bright light into thinking, no, it's kind of more like spring, where it is daylight. And that helps you when you're getting light in the morning, in the depths of winter there, to wake you up. And then you reverse engineer the trick in the summer, which is that in the evening, you want to try and not expose yourself to as much light. How do you do that? Well, if you're going out in the evening and it's still bright, you can wear shades. And then when you come home at night, as I know for a fact, because I've been to enough northern Scandinavian countries, that you have very deep, thick blackout curtains, and you can use eye masks. You really need to envelop yourself in darkness, because at that point during the summer, you are going to be a dark, deprived society. And if you don't get that darkness at night, you don't release the melatonin, and you will have sleep-wake disruption.
Perfect. Thank you so much for these tips. But as now we're heading into the darkest time of the winter, isn't it it's not just about waking up and getting that artificial sunlight or the sunlight? What about going out for lunch and walking to a restaurant or to your car? Is daylight throughout the day helping any with setting your circadian rhythm?
It is. And so during those short windows of daylight during the day that you do get in the middle of the winter, certainly trying to get exposure to that light is great. You don't necessarily need to be outside, but if you're going to be working, try to make sure, if you are privileged enough to have this opportunity, to work next to a window and get that natural daylight. Then also, there are other things that can help your brain and your body understand that it's daytime. Light is the principal way, light and darkness are the principal ways that we reset and we keep good circadian 24-hour time. But there are other things that the brain and the body can latch onto to reset the clock. One of those things is food. So try to eat at regular times, at the standard times that you would eat otherwise, because food can be a powerful cue to keep you regular in terms of your signaled schedule. And then also exercise. So exercising in the first half of the day, particularly in the middle of the winter, that can also help in terms of a cue that helps keep time in a more strict way for your brain and your body when it is confused about time, because the main source of its timekeeping is lost, which is reliable daylight during the day and reliable darkness at night.
You said that your body gets a message okay, it's light outside, it's time to be awake. I guess many Icelanders have oh, this is coffee, it's time to be awake. We kind of in the winter, it's pretty easy to just depend on the coffee. And I want to slide into the caffeine discussion and also about energy drinks being super popular amongst young Icelanders. But you're not against people drinking coffee, are you?
No, I think, when I first released the book, I was probably a little bit too puritanical and too strict about coffee. And I've changed my mind for a number of reasons. First is a strange paradox that a lot of people have written to me and said, I don't understand this. It doesn't seem to make sense, which is the following. Drinking coffee is associated with many health benefits. And we, of course, know that excessive caffeine can harm your sleep and be disruptive to sleep. And we'll speak about the ways in which that is in a second. But the strange thing is that coffee has many of the health benefits that we know sleep provides. So how is it possible that coffee, which we know disrupts your sleep, can have health benefits. The reason is because the coffee bean itself contains a huge, great, wonderful dose of something called antioxidants. And in fact, because most people aren't quite eating in the nutritious way that they need to, it turns out that the cup of coffee, the coffee bean, is the principal source of most of their antioxidants in their diet. And antioxidants are wonderful things in terms of your health. And so so it's got nothing to do with the caffeine. It's not caffeine that gives you the benefit. It's the antioxidants in the coffee bean. And a good demonstration of this is that decaffeinated coffee, which still contains the antioxidants but does not contain very much caffeine, is still associated with lots of health benefits. In other words, it's the coffee bean itself, not the caffeine in the coffee bean. But I would say that when it comes to caffeine, the dose and the timing makes the poison. So the first thing is that once you get past about 3 cups of coffee, the health benefits start to go back down in the opposite direction.
Sorry to interrupt, but 3 cups of coffee, are we talking about like 150 milligrams of caffeine or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So sort of 3 standard cups of drip coffee.
Okay.
Whereas, not the classic, and I won't name names, a large maybe coffee chain that begins with S and rhymes with Starbucks. One of the extra large cups of coffee, particularly a strong one, could actually be everything that you need. Could be up to 500 or 600 milligrams of caffeine. In fact, at that point, you're almost going too much.
Yeah.
But so, I would say maximum 3 cups of coffee a day. So that's the dose, but it's also the timing, because it turns out that caffeine has what we call a half-life of about 5 to 6 hours for the average human adult. What that means is that after 5 to 6 hours, 50% of that caffeine is still in your brain and your body. What that also means, however, is that caffeine has a quarter life of 10 to 12 hours. So if you, Snorri, were to have a cup of coffee, let's say at midday, well, then a quarter of that caffeine is still in your brain at midnight. So having a cup of coffee at midday is perhaps a little bit like getting into bed at midnight, and before you turn the light out, you swig a quarter of a cup of coffee and you hope for a good night of sleep. and it's probably not going to happen. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, the timing of your caffeine.
But I find it super interesting. You say like you're not against coffee and well, I guess you're not against caffeine, but as you say, it's the timing and the dose that makes the poison. But what about like energy drinks that don't have the antioxidants and only have the caffeine?
So I think it's fine to use caffeine strategically in the morning, with one big caveat, which is that if you have a dependency on that caffeine, if you feel as though you quote unquote need that caffeine to function appropriately, at that point you've transitioned over to a bad place, which is that you have a dependency. And once you are dependent on an agent, and caffeine is in a class of drugs that we call the psychoactive stimulants. Once you are dependent on that stimulant, on that compound, then that's usually a signal for a problem. And it's a problem because if you can't function throughout the day perfectly without caffeine, then it may be that you are not getting the sleep that you need. Because if you are sleeping well and giving yourself the right amount, and right now the recommendation is for most adults, somewhere between 7 to 9 hours of sleep is ideal, then if you are using too much caffeine, or you quote unquote need caffeine in the morning, you may be self-medicating your state of sleep deprivation. So just be careful of that. So I'm not that against the energy drinks. The only problem I have with energy drinks is that firstly, they tend to be consumed to excess and dependency develops. The second is that they usually don't have the very best additional ingredients in them. They often will have quite high amounts of sugar. And we know that sugar is deleterious for health and also deleterious for sleep, it turns out too. So I would probably say if you are looking for caffeine and a caffeine hit in the morning, firstly, ask yourself why. And do you quote unquote need it? And if you need it, ask yourself, should I try getting a bit more sleep? And if you don't feel you need it, which is great, I have usually, I'm very sensitive to caffeine, and I'll explain a little bit, if you would like me to, about why different people have different sensitivities to caffeine.
Please.
But yes, so I would say that overall, when it comes to a cup of coffee or cups of coffee, the dose and the timing makes the poison. But I'll come back to the variability in a second. Maybe I could say a little bit more about, however, the damage that caffeine can have on your sleep at night, because it can harm your sleep. And it harms your sleep in at least probably 3 different ways. The first is that because caffeine is a stimulant, it makes it harder to fall asleep. So you struggle a bit more to drift off at night. The second problem with caffeine is that it will fragment your sleep. So you are much more likely to be waking up more frequently throughout the night when you've had too much caffeine, and therefore you find it harder to fall back asleep. So caffeine can mimic the 2 principal types of insomnia, which is what we call sleep onset insomnia, I can't fall asleep, and sleep maintenance insomnia, which is I wake up and I can't fall back asleep, I can't stay asleep. But let's say that you're one of those individuals, and I'll explain why in a second, that says, look, I can have an espresso with dinner and I fall asleep fine and I don't remember waking up at night. So everything is just fine. The danger there is that even if that's true, and it can be true for some people, caffeine will also decrease the amount of deep sleep that you get at night. And some studies have demonstrated that it can decrease that amount of deep sleep, particularly in the first couple of the hours of the night, by anywhere between 50 to 30%. Now, just to give you a context, for me to decrease the amount of deep sleep that you get by even 15%, I would probably have to age you by about 10 to 12 years.
Wow.
Or you could just do it every night with, an espresso. So I just want to give people that information. I don't want to scare people. And the second thing I do not want to do is tell anyone how to live their life, because all I am is a scientist. It's not my job to tell people how to live their life. And of course, life is to be lived, to a degree. So all I want to do as a scientist is tell you about the science behind these things, and then you can make an informed choice as to how you want to live your life. I have no business telling anyone how to live their life. Exactly,
that's a great point. And like also of like not taking the route of like banning things, but like to change behaviors, and that being, well, like drinking less or drinking earlier.
That's right, in terms of the caffeine. Yes.
In terms of the caffeine. But I'm curious, like you yourself being a scientist, you've probably gone to like through a heavy academic studies and working all day and maybe like through the night. What is it with people wanting to be like high alert all the time? And I'm guessing that you know where I'm going with this. Like you don't want to feel drowsy. You don't want to feel tired ever unless you're sleeping. So you want to be on throughout the whole day.
That's right. And one of the ironies of drinking too much caffeine is that you will have some of the features that I've just described. Either you won't find it easy to get enough sleep, or the quality of that deep sleep is going to be worse. But the danger is that sometimes you don't remember waking up throughout the night. And certainly you're not going to remember having less deep sleep, because none of us have a subjective sense of that. That's measured electrically. But then the next morning, you feel as though you're kind of groggy. You don't feel refreshed or restored by your sleep. So now you're starting to use 3 to 4 cups of coffee during the day to wake you up. And then that subsequent evening, your sleep is even worse. So the following day, you feel even less refreshed by your sleep. And now it goes up to 4 to 5 cups of coffee. Cycle. And it's a vicious cycle. And then what we've also seen in some countries, including here in America, is that as that sense of my sleep becoming worse and worse, and my dependency on increasing my caffeine intake increases, I find it harder to fall asleep at night. So then I look to prescription drugs like sleeping pills to knock me out at night. And then those sleeping pills start to make me feel even more drowsy during the day. So I drink even more caffeine. And so you've got this, what we call an upper and downer dependency. You're taking stimulants during the day to wake you up, and you're taking too much stimulant. And then you need a sedative at night to knock you out because of the excessive stimulant. And then you need more stimulant the following day because you have a hangover effect from the sedative at night. And once again, we get this vicious cycle. So that's a real extreme, but just be aware of perhaps that type of nature in your behavior or that of your friends. And of course, yes, we all want to be alert and awake during the day. But I think we forget sometimes that sleep, if we're getting enough sleep, will give us plenty of focused alertness during the day. And with caffeine, it is a fool's gold because people think that they're more productive and they're more alert with caffeine. And now that's somewhat true. Your basic reaction time is faster when you've had caffeine. However, when we sleep deprive people and then we give them caffeine to see if we can get them over that insufficient sleep, it doesn't help with any of the other aspects of complex cognitive brain performance, like learning and memory, or problem solving, or productivity, or creativity, or emotional regulation. Those things aren't salvaged by caffeine. So I would probably say when it comes to caffeine, yes, we all want to be alert and awake during the day. Sleep can give you that same magnitude of alertness. And we also perhaps want to change our mindset and it's so understandable. Most of us think that when we sleep, our body is just dormant and nothing much happens in our brain. So, what's the harm in not getting so much of it? It just seems like rest, and I can do without rest. Firstly, sleep is your life support system. It services every system in your body and every neural circuit of your brain. The second thing, however, is that when you are well slept, when I say to people, look, why are you drinking so much caffeine and why are you so keen to be awake throughout the day? And the answer is usually because I'm so busy. I've got so much to do, so much I want to accomplish. I want to be productive. I want to be focused. Well, the irony is that when you are getting sufficient sleep, your efficiency of your work is that much higher. And so people will say to me, I'm awake for all of this time because I've got so much to do, but sometimes I'm just staring at the screen and now I'm reading this paragraph for the third time because I just can't process it because I'm not alert enough because I'm not getting enough sleep at night. So the good news is that you can get the 7 to 9 hours of sleep that you need. And because you are going to be so much more productive the following day, you will accomplish all that you need to in less amount of time. So you won't need as much time. So, think about a pot of water on a stove that you're trying to boil, and you're trying to boil that water. Why would you boil that water on medium heat when you could boil that water in half of the time on high heat? Sleep is high heat. You can do that stuff in less time. And therefore, that's perhaps the reason that you've got so much to do is because you're not sleeping enough and you're not as productive. That's one idea.
It feels like you have to sacrifice so much to test that theory. Going early to bed and waking up after 8 hours, it's super complicated for a lot of people, and also it's a trap that you want to feel busy, I guess. Like it's a virtue to wake up early and show up for work and having done your CrossFit class or running 10K or whatever it is.
That is such a fantastic observation, Snorri, that I often have asked, okay, why do people say, I'm so busy? What is it about that? And you hear it so often. And I think it's because we equate busyness with importance. That if I'm busy, if I'm a busy person, then perhaps that signals that, I've got a lot to do and maybe I'm an important person, which we all want to feel as though we're contributing. We have relevance in this life. And I think that's great. I want that too.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that we can show that we are busy and that we have relevance in this world is by saying things like, I don't have the chance to sleep. I've got so much to be doing. I'm so busy. I don't have time to sleep because I'm such a busy person.
Yeah, this is my 6th cup of coffee today.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I don't remember your name, even though you just introduced it to me 2 minutes ago. And so I think it's one of the societal stigmas that we equate getting sufficient sleep, and I choose my words very carefully by saying sufficient, not excessive, but getting sufficient sleep, with this thing called laziness, with being slothful. And what's strange to me is that we don't always have that mentality. So, for example, no one would look at an infant, a baby sleeping during the day, and say, gosh, what a lazy baby. No one says that. Why? Because we know that at that moment in life, sleep is non-negotiable. It's absolutely necessary. But if you look at the data, somewhere now, even between early childhood and certainly teenagehood and adulthood, not only do we abandon the notion that sleep is important and to be celebrated, we stigmatize it and we chastise people who are getting sufficient sleep. And I know some people who've said to me, when people have asked me how much sleep do I get, and I tell them usually about 8 hours of sleep a night, the reaction from other people is, really? You get 8 hours of sleep? And it's almost a statement of a judgment, which is, really? You get 8 hours of sleep? And, do we look down on people who get the sleep that they need? And that's a very strange mentality, because it took Mother Nature about 3.6 million years to evolve this necessity in human beings of a 7 to 9 hour sleep need. And then within the blink of an evolutionary eye, within a lifetime, all of a sudden we as individuals, we think, maybe we know better than Mother Nature. Maybe I know that I don't really need the sleep that she thinks that I need. And so I'm just going to thin slice it. I'm just going to go down to 6.5 hours of sleep or 6 hours of sleep. Well, we know from the studies that unfortunately, the elastic band of sleep deprivation will stretch only so far before it snaps in terms of your health. And we now know that there are a broad collection. In fact, most diseases that are killing us in developed worlds, from cardiovascular disease to diabetes, obesity, also mental health issues such as suicidality, as well as dementia, all of those things have significant, and many of them, causal links to insufficient sleep.
Wow. Yeah. And I want to touch a bit more on the 14 to 16-year-old in Iceland having the highest consumption of caffeine in whole of Europe, and I guess that's not something we're very proud of. But I don't want to blame anything, and I know that you don't want to do it either. It's not the energy drinks or it's not the coffee, but can we talk a bit about the effects of too much caffeine and then therefore bad sleep for kids in the age of 14 to 16 years old? I guess you said teenagehood. Is this a crucial time in their life to get their full night's sleep?
It is absolutely crucial, and it's crucial for at least 3 reasons. The first is that there is a major developmental burst in brain neural architecture when we are young, in our first couple of years of life. And at that point, it's almost like an internet service provider going into all of these new neighborhoods and wiring them up with high-speed broadband connections. And we get a huge population of all of these connections. And then once that's set up across childhood, we maintain that degree of connectivity to a degree, but then something remarkable happens, which is that once we go into those teenage years, from ages, on average, perhaps somewhere between 12 to 18 years old, the opposite happens, which is where the brain says, okay, I've had enough experience now of this thing called life, where I'm going to make this brain efficient. Because let's say that once you've wired up all of those houses in those different neighborhoods with broadband connection, over time, you get enough data, you get enough experience to realize some of those neighborhoods consume a high amount of data and require even stronger connections. Other parts of those districts, they're not being used. And so the brain starts to actually sculpt away the unnecessary things, which is essential to become an adult brain and a good, efficient adult brain. So in fact, it's during those teen years that the brain starts to decrease the number of connections, or what we call synapses, in the brain. And what we've discovered is that one of the principal, if not the principal factor that starts to sculpt away, it's almost like putting clay on a pedestal when you're creating a sculpture. When we're young, we pack all of the clay onto the sculpture. And then in our teenage years, we start to carve out the true structure of the statue of this thing called the human brain. And if you don't get sleep at that time during teenage years, the brain doesn't develop and become efficient and highly efficient in the same way. And it's sleep, and particularly deep sleep, which is the type of sleep, by the way, that caffeine can impact most dramatically, that does the work of pruning the brain and making it going from inefficient and excessive to efficient and precise and almost like a very, well-tuned car engine. That's what sleep is doing in the teenage years, and that's why it is so important. The second reason is because sleep acts as one of the best barriers against this thing that we call mental health problems. And the place where many psychiatric conditions start to emerge in terms of the place on the lifespan is during teenage years, during adolescence. That's when we are most vulnerable to the development of numerous psychiatric disorders. Other disorders will come and go at different ages. I'm not saying they all happen at that time period, but many of them, we start to see the emergence, the diagnosis of them at that stage of life. Meaning at that stage of life, you are especially vulnerable to mental health issues. Why is this important? Because what we've discovered is that sleep is one of the best support structures to prevent the collapse of your emotional health into psychiatric conditions. Sleep is essentially emotional first aid.
Into psychiatric conditions such as
depression, anxiety, suicidality, trauma, things such as PTSD, etc. And also there's been some great work recently linking sleep disturbance in schizophrenia. We also know of significant links between sleep deficiency and ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactive disorder. So all of these things we know, or many of those conditions that I just described, as well as bipolar disorder, which I should mention too, many of those things seem to have their greatest vulnerability window of expression during teenage years. And if sleep is something that helps you step yourself back from the dangerous edge of these things called psychiatric conditions, then getting sleep at that time of life perhaps could be argued as never being more important across your entire lifespan for your mental health. The final two, actually, it's probably four things. The final two things, firstly, is, that's the time when, a lot of our education grades are going to dictate our future. In other words, we're now starting to move into those years where we're starting to become a bit more specialized in terms of our education. We're picking more and more subjects that we want to focus on. Those subjects will ultimately determine what our grades are for us to be able to get to university. And then that university period will and can define some of our trajectories in life. Not always, but a lot of it. And so we know that when kids are getting sufficient sleep at that time of life, academic grades increase. So sleep is a lubricant to better academic performance. The final thing is much more practical. We know that if we move that age range up that we're speaking about, here in America, And actually, you'll have to tell me, I don't know if it's 15 or 16, the legal age to be able to drive on the roads or start driving on the roads there for you is it 16 or is it?
In Iceland?
Yeah.
It's 17.
17.
Yeah.
Okay. Even more sensible. But what we've discovered is that in studies here done in the United States, where you can start driving at the age of 16, the leading cause of death in late stage teenagers here in the United States and in many countries in the ages of 16 to 18 is not suicide. That's second. The leading cause is road traffic accidents. And here sleep matters enormously. There was one great study done here in America where they delayed school start times for teenagers, which they start the schools here idiotically early in the morning, as in a number of other first world nations. And those kids were able to get 1 hour of extra sleep. And the following year, there was a 70% reduction in vehicle accidents within that region.
70.
After they made the team. 70% reduction in car crashes in that narrow age range of 16 to 18. Now, to give you a sense of what that means, the advent of what we call ABS technology in cars, which is anti-lock brake systems that prevent your wheels from locking up under hard braking so you can still maneuver the car, that dropped accident rates by about 20 to 25%. And it was thought to be a revolution in safety, in car safety. Well, here is a simple biological factor, this thing called allowing our teenagers to get enough sleep that can drop accident rates by up to 70%.
And we're
on
talking
average,
about 1 hour.
That's right. Just 1 hour.
Jesus. That's, yeah. And okay.
So I don't know if that helps impress the importance of, it's not just important for one reason, it's important for so many reasons. The development of the brain, academic grades, mental health, as well as just, physical reality, mortality health when you're getting behind the wheel.
But what about have you, when you're speaking to people and talking about the importance of sleep and you're like telling a teenager that this is the most important time in his life to get a good night's sleep, that guy must be pretty disciplined and good at delaying gratification to take it seriously and not like partying or staying up late with friends or doing whatever. But a simple moment from my life was I was doing a lot of strength training in my teenage years, and one of my friends went to a seminar, and the guy at the seminar said that you can get free steroids by sleeping 9.5 hours each night. And my friend came back to training with this information, and we were like, okay, so 9.5 hours it is for us. Like, we have to do that. And it was just information about human growth hormone would skyrocket with a good night's sleep.
That's right.
And that was like, do you know where I'm going with this? Like, you have to have a hook on it. It's not like that easy to tell people that it's important for brain health and stuff that you almost cannot feel or sense in a way.
That's true. And so firstly, just to come to your point, we know that sleep is perhaps the very best legal performance enhancing drug that most people are not using enough of it. If I take a young male like yourself and I limit them to 5 hours or 4 hours of sleep a night for 1 week, your levels of testosterone are that of someone 10 years your senior. In other words, a lack of sleep will age a man by a decade in terms of that critical aspect of wellness and virility. The second thing is that it's during sleep and that nighttime phase when we release growth hormone. And what we've discovered is that, for example, things such as alcohol, which is also not great for your sleep. Many people use alcohol as a way to try to get to sleep. That's not a good idea. Alcohol is a sedative and it's just sedating you. It's not putting you into natural sleep. Alcohol will also block your REM sleep, your rapid eye movement sleep. And rapid eye movement sleep is critical for emotional and mental health, but it's also critical for hormonal health because it's during rapid eye movement sleep when we see the highest releases of testosterone in both men and women, because it turns out that testosterone isn't just needed for men. Men and women both require testosterone, different levels, of course. So your friend was absolutely right in thinking that this is one way to game the system. Which is ironic because, you see a lot of people who are dedicated and focused on to the gym saying, I'm going to wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning. I'm going to crush it at the gym, when you may be getting better returns for your hard gym work investment if only you were to sleep in a little bit more. But you're right in the sense that you have to have a hook to try to bring people in. They're not just going to do it because some scientist with a strange British accent, pretends to say something meaningful about sleep. Or we can do it in a different way, which is that we can design society around teenagers, which we don't do right now, because teenagers don't want to go to sleep at the same time as their parents. Often teenagers want to go to sleep later and wake up much later. Now, this is not your teenagers being rebellious, and it's not your teenagers just simply wanting to try to be independent or be lazy. It is a biological shift. We can measure it. It comes back to their circadian rhythm, that their circadian rhythm, when they were younger, was wanting them to go to bed early and wake up early. Even though kids, often think, I want to stay up with the adults at night. And they stay up, and all of a sudden at 8 p.m. in the evening, they're asleep, on the floor, and you have to carry them to bed because they can't stay awake, even though they want to stay awake. Well, the opposite is true once we go into our teenage years. All of a sudden, that 24-hour rhythm starts moving forward in time. You want to go to bed later and later and later and wake up later and later. So why don't we design society to allow teenagers, firstly, to sleep in harmony with their biology rather than against their biology, which is the way that society is designed for teenagers right now. Now, I know this is hard because it means that then parents have to change their schedule, schools have to change their schedules. But what are we interested in here? Are we interested in allowing our young next generation to develop properly and to get the very best form of education and become the very best version of themselves? If that's the case, we need to give sleep more of a voice in this discussion of structured society. And I think the other component of that is, sleep for those kids at that time of life, as I said, is so critically important. Is it really that hard to design a different way of living for them? Because we've put people on the moon. I'm sure we can do other things too that are difficult. And maybe this one isn't that difficult if we were to put some thought into it. Now, I don't mean to trivialize that. Again, I'm a scientist. I don't know how hard it is to change the education system or change parental work times and work schedules to allow this to happen. I think it's very difficult. But I still think it's something that we should at least think about and attempt, even if ultimately we can't solve. So to your question, instead of asking the individuals to change or become more disciplined, why don't we give them a societal structure that adopts or allows them to adopt getting enough sleep that they need so that they can have, whatever social media and whatever social interactions that they need in the evening and late into the evening. And then they fall asleep at the time that they want to. And then we allow them to wake, goodness knows, I'm sure they wouldn't mind waking up later in the morning as well. So all of a sudden we get teenagers who are well slept, and we get teenagers who go on to be the very best versions of themselves once they become adults.
Yeah, that's a great point. You said that sleep is probably one of those underused performance-enhancing drugs. After I read your book and listened to interviews with you, I realized how important sleep is, and it almost turned to a point where I was getting worried if I weren't getting my good night's sleep in. Isn't that also some sort of a paradox where you go you worry that your sleep isn't good enough, so your stress levels go up? Isn't that something that a fine balance over there?
It is, and I think it's a really important point, and it's something that I've become much more sensitive to. I think when I started being more public about this thing called sleep, and again, it really wasn't my choice. I was stupid enough to write a book, and it ended up putting me in that position. But I think at the time when I was writing the book, sleep was the neglected stepsister in the health conversation of the day. That people just, it didn't seem to be so much on the radar. And I was so sad to see all of the disease, all of the sickness and the suffering that was happening because people weren't getting sufficient sleep. And of course, if you didn't know about sleep, you wouldn't necessarily prioritize it. And we were doing much better in terms of advisories regarding being more physically active and also eating in a better way. but sleep wasn't quite there yet. And I wanted to be one of the people, like many of my colleagues, I'm not the only one, they've done wonderful things too, to try and help get the education of sleep out there. And I think I was so excited to get the message out there that I was a little bit too heavy-handed. And I think some people, after they read the book or they watched the TED Talk, it was almost, sleep or else ... It's sort of like, sleep or die. And for some people, not for all people, but for a percentage of people, it ends up becoming so provoking that they become anxious about their sleep. And when you become sleep anxious, you normally start to sleep less well. And so what I would say is, I'm not going to lie about the facts of sleep. Sleep is important, and there are studies that we can look at, very good studies published in wonderful journals where, even after one night of 4 hours of sleep, you can see a reduction in, critical immune cells that help fight against cancer. I'm not going to not provide that information. But the other thing I would say, which I didn't say enough early on, was that, look, everyone has a bad night of sleep. Don't worry about it. I am not immune. I've actually had my exposure to periods of insomnia in my lifetime. I've probably had at least 2 bouts of insomnia. So I'm no stranger. Just because I know a little bit about it doesn't mean, I'm any better necessarily than other people. And second, a couple of bad nights of sleep or a bad night of sleep, it's not the end of the world. Just understand that the following day, you're probably not going to be the very best version of yourself emotionally and empathetically and physiologically, more importantly, or as importantly, I should say. And then, don't worry, get back to bed, use the appropriate rules that we give in terms of, tips for better sleep, get yourself back on a good schedule, and things will be fine. If it starts to transition over to becoming a chronic condition where night after night, or at least 3 nights a week, you're struggling with sleep and you're not feeling good during the day as a consequence, that's the time to go and see a doctor and actually explore interventions for sleep. And the principal one you want to explore is not necessarily a sleeping pill, but it's something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI, which is the first line recommended treatment for insomnia. And it's just as effective as sleeping pills, and it doesn't have any of the side effects. But I don't, if you are someone who is sleep anxious or you're really struggling with sleep, I've had emails from readers who've said, I was struggling with insomnia. I read your book and it made a huge difference to my life, and I'm sleeping so much better. Thank you. And then there are other people who've written to me to say, I was struggling with sleep. I read your book and it only made things worse because I'm now even more worried. And so firstly, the book was never designed to be a book that helps people sleep. It's called Why We Sleep, rather than, 15 tips to better sleep but I didn't make clear, and I now have in a subsequent new edition to say, look, this book is not designed as a sleep therapy book. But if you are someone who is struggling with sleep and you are quite anxious about sleep, then I would probably say, wait until your sleep gets better and you've got some treatment and it's under control, and then read the book if you want to read the book. And if not, it's the same way with sleep trackers, by the way. If these sleep trackers are every morning that you wake up, just simply reinforcing to you that your sleep wasn't great and you already know that, it's only going to make things worse. And it develops a condition that we call orthosomnia. Now, you've heard of ortho, like orthopedics or orthodontics.
Yeah.
Orthodontics is about straightening teeth. Orthopedics is about straightening bones. Orthosomnia is a worry about getting your sleep straight, getting your sleep perfect. And what happens with people once they start wearing, for a small percentage, they start wearing these sleep trackers, and then they start to get too anxious and too hyper-focused on their sleep. And then their sleep becomes even worse because once again, they get anxious. So it is a fine balance. Don't get too stressed out. If you're in bed lying awake at night and you're thinking, oh my goodness, I had this interview with this guy who's telling me how important it was, it's going to help against, Alzheimer's disease and cardiovascular disease. And if I'm not getting sleep, I'm going to develop those things. Don't worry, because the harder that you try to sleep, the less likely it is to happen. It's like trying to remember someone's name. The harder you try, the further away that it goes from you. And when you stop trying, all of a sudden you remember the name. It's the same way with sleep. So don't get too anxious.
Yeah, it's funny how something that comes so natural to us is so difficult for some people and in periods in their lives.
Yeah, exactly. Snorri, I'm probably going to have to go and teach in about 1 minute's time.
Yeah. Matthew, this has been such a delightful chat with you. I just want to thank you so much for taking time to do this. I will see you here in Iceland 22nd of November. And Matthew, just once again, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for the time and the opportunity to speak. And for now being, by the way, yourself a sleep ambassador. You're getting the message out there. So thank you very much. It was lovely to chat with you. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.